Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, people of all fandoms, welcome to the Ferret and Raccoon podcast, episode 129. I am the Angry Raccoon, your only host for this podcast, and yeah, as you can probably already tell by the length of this podcast, it's going to be a short one. There was no real need for me to bring on anyone else for this episode because, yeah, there really hasn't been a lot of stuff to talk about over the last 2 weeks. I think everyone is pretty much more content with worrying about either politics, Christmas, or the new year. So trailers have kind of been a bit slow. It's been a lot of like regurgitation for the most part. For example, Star Wars, or I guess Disney, or however you want to refer to them as, a lot of like specials on the new film and exclusive clips and all that kind of rubbish. Another trailer, you can kind of smell the desperation for them to really want this film to do great, despite the fact no one really cares anymore. You had like another trailer for Trolls World Tour, another trailer for Disney's Onward, and there was even another trailer for Cats. I mean, like, really, you don't really have much of a chance if your competition is Disney's Frozen 2 and Star Wars. Like, I really don't know why Cats is trying. They really should just push the date back if they want to have an attempt at actually making some money. Taylor Swift is not going to save your film. Anyway, I digress. Let's actually crack onto this podcast, which is actually going up on the 2nd of December, so Christmas is pretty damn close for the most part, and I am already sick of the Christmas advertisements, as they pretty much had already started in early November, and it seems like it's probably going to get worse. So, yeah. For the most part, what I've been up to is I've generally been catching up with things. I finished off a lot of things. I didn't really watch too much. Once again, I'm in between things, like finishing things like television series and that, and or of course watching the last few things I want to watch before the end of the year for the end of the year podcast, which is coming up pretty soon. But the two main things I did watch over the last 2 weeks was Vice's The Wrestlers, which is a 2016 or I think 2017 10-episode documentary series by Vice or Viceland, essentially talking about wrestling all around the world. It doesn't really talk about WWE. This is not about WWE wrestling for the most part. This is almost everything but that. And this was a pretty interesting and fascinating series that dives into wrestling today, its past, and where it possibly could go. Each episode kind of tackles a different subject matter and usually a different country. The main countries it does focus on being America, Japan, and Mexico. And even still, you may know of Japanese wrestling or Mexican wrestling, but they go into far more interesting and deeper dives. Like, for example, with the Mexican wrestling or luchador wrestling, one episode is spent talking about the exotico wrestlers, who are essentially either gay males or transgendered wrestlers, and that's the name they refer to them as, exotico, as they have a slightly more homosexual or camp look and kind of performance to how they wrestle. And it kind of talks about acceptance and the fact that there are wrestlers who have made gender transitions, and they want to be accepted as either one or the other. They don't necessarily want this exotico label, but at the same time there are comments regarding the fact that a lot of Mexican people seem to really dislike the exoticos, and they kind of play off the negativity and they play up the stereotypes of homosexuality. So it's a very interesting episode. There's another episode that focuses on a very interesting thing which I didn't even know existed, which I'd imagine, which they kind of do say in the episode, most people don't know about, is voodoo wrestling in Africa. Yeah, voodoo wrestling is a thing in Africa, because apparently in Africa, in parts of the Republic of Congo, I forget the exact place they went and filmed, wrestling is huge there. It's a big deal. And you do see a lot of interesting things that definitely are very weird, but are very interesting and, worth mentioning. Like, for example, new and upcoming wrestlers, wrestlers retiring, female wrestlers, for example, as well as like really extreme and interesting things like death matches, for example, which is the last episode. if you have at least a fainting interest in wrestling, or you only know wrestling via WWE, I would highly recommend watching this series. It does unfortunately fall under the trappings of Vice's more modern day, I guess, mantra of they just have to talk about things that either revolve around drugs or American politics. And there is a lot of cases where I find myself going, you really didn't need to bring in American politics or, some other subject matters that, I mean, I don't care at the end of the day. If you're making a show about wrestling, talk about wrestling. Don't try and bring up like Trump and all that kind of stuff. It just kind of gets a bit annoying when you take the main focus off something that doesn't really matter in this context. It's kind of stupid. It's like watching a baking show and then they start talking about World War II. It doesn't make any sense. The other thing I watched was a decent-ish horror film called The Midnight Man. Generic name aside, this film was okay for the most part. It's essentially your run-of-the-mills kind of monster, boogeyman, rule-based horror film. The setup is very simple, takes place in a house, you play a game, and you have to survive the Midnight Man. It had a few neat things in it. There were some nice uses of practical effects, but at the same time there were some very bad and somewhat comedic uses of practical effects. There were a few shots which didn't look that all believable, and they kept showing them. And that's kind of like this film's biggest problem, is it keeps repeating itself and making things way too obvious, and a lot of unnecessary flashbacks for the most part. A good example is very early on in the film. I won't spoil anything because this is a 2016 film. There's a point where one of the characters essentially confronts the Midnight Man, for example, and we get the scene where we see how much of a threat the Midnight Man is, and we essentially understand like the rules and the consequences, and everything kind of gets set up, to which another character is basically like, yeah, I know, I met the Midnight Man, I know that this is real. And then they show the whole scene of this character encountering the Midnight Man, and it's like, it doesn't necessarily you can't really scare someone once they already know what the consequences and what the threat is, especially when they try and be suspenseful with it. It was a bit stupid for them to do that. But other than that, there were some interesting moments. Like, I like the fact that the Midnight Man himself basically just cheats at his own game. There are rules which you can do to essentially, save yourself, but he just cheats. He just cheats all the time, which is a bit cheap at the same time, but it's kind of funny. There's a point where he's literally like, oh yeah, I'm gonna stop you from preventing me from getting you, and a character manages to like stop him in a very like tense scene, to which he basically goes, fuck it, I'm done, and just like ruins it. It is quite funny. I mean, it's not the worst thing I've ever seen. It's not insultingly bad. It's just okay. The characters are really stupid, which I really didn't like, because there was one character who at least had a brain, and I'm surprised what happened with them. But there was a moment where it was literally like, hey, you stay there, we're gonna go and get this thing to save you. And while it's a big, rush, we don't have a lot of time, these two characters going off to save another character decide to stop and talk. And it's like, oh, so you really are awful people who do not care about your best friend. I thought that was really, really stupid. And also, why are you playing a game that involves like some kind of demonic entity in the first place? I found that very silly. I mean, the main setup is you find this box which is sealed, you open it, your grandmother comes down screaming in horror, and you're like, you know what? Let's go back and check that box and play that game. I really don't understand that kind of stuff. That's the kind of stuff that really bothers me in horror films, and it's why horror nowadays and kind of always has been a bit of a joke, depending on what it's about. But those are the two main things I watched over the last fortnight. I've got a ton of things I'm currently watching at the moment, so whether we do one more podcast or two more podcasts before the end of the year, I've got a lot to say. Moving on to the rich content that we have on the podcast. The first trailer we're going to talk about is Knives and Skin, not to be confused with Knives Out, which everyone seems to like for some reason. This was a film I knew about a couple months ago, and I didn't talk about it on the podcast because there just wasn't enough in there to talk about it, and I really didn't get it. And I think given that we have such a barren podcast, I might as well talk about it here as soon as we got a bit more of a longer and I guess coherent trailer. And the problem with this trailer and maybe this film is that it feels like it's trying too hard to be weird and a bit too hard to be like Twin Peaks. I mean, it basically has the same base story as Twin Peaks, being a woman being murdered in a very strange town with even more strange individuals or residents that have connections to, dark things. And it's a bit of a shame that it's not even really trying to be original, and they're essentially trying to make up for this lack of uncreativity through style over substance, essentially. And you can kind of see that with the fact that it has this very out of place, like, 80s vibe. And I mean, it doesn't take place in the 80s. I'm pretty sure it doesn't, because I may not be like a master at fashion, but there are certain clothing that I could see does not come from, it comes from all over eras, basically. I mean, I didn't see a cell phone, but then again, who knows? It could be an alternate world, whatever. And I think the fact that the post-production has clearly had color correction to just add color for more of a vibrant vibe, because color just equals style. It doesn't, just to let you know. And I thought that was kind of lame. It feels like it's overcompensating for something. It just comes across as weird for no reason. And you can do weird for no reason with a reason, if that makes sense. But this film just seems like it's nonsensical, and it's going, oh, because we're nonsensical, there's reason behind our nonsense, which doesn't make any sense, if that makes sense. It was a bit bothersome because, I mean, every speaking person in this film just seems like a vain, awful person. And it really makes me question, like, why I should care or even be interested in this film, given that we essentially have a bunch of weirdos that either all have the same character or have no character. I mean, I really don't understand the intention of this film, and I think this is just like some artsy-fartsy, pretentious piece of rubbish we have here, where it's like, begging to be understood and all that kind of stuff. But at the end of the day, it just seems like a little bit of a, the 80s is popular, people like Twin Peaks, let's do something like that, without any real rhyme or reason. Oh yeah, grab a bit of meat and throw it at a car. It doesn't mean anything, but people will think it means something, so that means that it means something. You don't have to explain. I get that you don't have to explain everything, but you can't really make a film without at least having some kind of creativity that begs for it to be, essentially, I'm trying to think of the word. The word is escaping me, but I think, well, hopefully you get what I mean. I mean, some of the costume designs in this film were pretty cool. I really liked the girl in the parade leader outfit. I thought her whole look looked pretty good with the very big glasses, which clearly are not from that era. But other than that, I just thought it looked okay. I did kind of check the general ratings, and it seems like people were like, yeah, it's fine. It's not really a film that I really care to watch. But, I mean, I just thought it was worth talking about, because I think maybe someone listening will probably get a kick out of this film, especially if you're not very experienced with films. You've never seen a David Lynch film, you might like this. So there's a soft recommendation, I guess. The next film is a weird one, another weird one, and essentially a teaser trailer, but I thought the teaser trailer was done well enough for the point of me to be able or want to talk about it, and that is Antebellum. I believe I said that right, Antebellum. Now, this film, given that it only has like a minute teaser trailer, which is some of my favorites because you don't need 5 minutes to, show the whole film, it has the potential to be really unique, something like, Get Out, or as dumb as something like, I don't know, something as dumb as Knives and Skin, or some other pretentious film. I actually didn't write anything for as dumb as, because there's too many dumb films. I'm trying to think of that one film that came out recently where it essentially like took place in a computer. Serenity, yeah. Yeah, or it could be as dumb as Serenity, basically, where if you've seen Serenity, which I do not recommend watching the new Serenity film, which has nothing to do with the video game or the previous film, it's really thinks it's smarter than it actually is, and it just comes off being extremely ignorant and dumb. And it thinks it's way smarter than it actually is. But as mysterious as this trailer is, let's be real, it's basically the butterfly effect or the Mandela effect. Or essentially a simulation, which I think it is a simulation, given I've only watched this trailer once, but even I could tell that it's like a simulation. With Janelle Monáe, who's a fantastic singer, and it's very interesting to see her acting. I'll be arranging to see how she does performing in an acting role. I think you got to understand with this film is that race commentary or black lead actors and simulations are pretty big in horror right now. A few examples being like Jordan Peele's Us that came out earlier this year. You had Ma, which wasn't a great film, but it came out earlier this year. You also have films like Happy Death Day, Escape Room, and even next year I just found out there is a film actually called The Mandela Effect, which I think is out now, but I don't think England's getting until next year, which essentially is about the Mandela Effect, or essentially a simulation, as well as Fantasy Island, which I'm not talking about on this podcast because it looks awful, but that film is basically about a simulation, essentially, or a fantasy. So this is what this film is going off. It essentially, I think its main idea or point is if slavery did and didn't exist. You know, like the butterfly effect. What if you went back in the past and did something that changed the present? Or what if people thought slavery was a different thing, or thought it never happened, or it wasn't as bad as it was? To some extent, it's obviously a simulation. And I will be honest, I am pretty interested to see what exactly is going on, whether it's, as I said, whether it's going to be really unique and smart, or if it's going to be dumb and obnoxious. I do not know. I'm also very interested to see what is the deal with the obligatory creepy white child. Because, of course, if you're making a horror film, you have to have a white creepy child. That's just standard. But generic aside, I mean, I'm interested in this film. I think they've already kind of given away what this film's going to be about. The poster is just an image of a butterfly that's bleeding. So it's not as mysterious as you think it's going to be, which is a bit of a shame. But hey, it might actually end up surprising me. It might end up surprising people. So you never know. I won't say this film looks like garbage. I will just say I won't be surprised, basically. But I'm super interested in it. And that's pretty much going to wrap up this podcast. I have one more trailer to talk about, and it is more of a recommendation because I'm such a big fan of this series, and I'm so glad it's getting a second season, which will be airing after this podcast comes out, and I will definitely be watching this. And that is going to be Joe Pera Talks With You Season 2. There isn't really too much to say about this season, not because of spoilers, but simply because it's such a short trailer, and I think you really do get a general sense of who Joe Pera is and kind of what this show is, being a very down-to-earth, slice-of-life, slow comedy following Mr. Joe Pera himself. And for something that is so mild-mannered and so simple and doesn't appear funny, I'm super hyped for this series. Big time. It's going to be probably the last series I watch this year, as in new series. I cannot wait to see Joe Pera shopping, and I cannot wait to see Joe Pera in the beauty salon, which is an episode, apparently, as well as an episode about beans. So yeah, that's the level of quality you have to expect with Joe Pera. So I'd highly recommend catching up with Season 1 of Joe Pera. Like I said a couple podcasts back, it's a super short season. You could probably finish the whole season in about, I would say probably about 80 minutes. Probably even less than that. Each episode's about 10 minutes long. And yeah, that's pretty much going to wrap up the podcast. I want to leave you guys with the video of the episode, which is going to be by Danny Brown, and that's Best Life. And I'm so happy this song actually got a music video, because it is one of my favorite songs of 2019. And given what the song is about, and given the kind of mixture of both optimism and also kind of sadness that's kind of interestingly blended into the lyrics and what is being seen in the visuals, as well as the music itself, kind of having a very cheery but somewhat, hip-hop dark beat to some extent, which is kind of subtly blended in there. I'm really happy, and I really wanted to share this music video. There wasn't a lot that's come out this week. I think everyone's kind of stopped releasing and making music because the Grammys have already done their nominations. So obviously anyone who's Grammy desperate isn't going to bother to release their album right now. And that's another thing. I was going to talk about the Grammys, but looking at the nominees, oh boy, that was just oh god. Like, this is why I didn't talk about it, because it's just baffling as hell. Yeah, the only other thing to say about this podcast is I am arranging the end of the year podcast. Whether or not we're going to do it earlier or later, I do not know. If we have another podcast that's as short as this, we might make podcast 130 the end of the year podcast, if there's nothing to talk about. To which there might be a slightly delayed gap in which when it gets uploaded. So, for example, it most likely will go up on the 20th. But if not, you might get an episode 30, and then episode 31 might be the end of the year podcast. They might just be a week apart. So that's kind of the general structure of how things might happen, soon as we are already in December. And given that at the time of this upload, we're about, 23 days away from Christmas, so it's pretty exciting. I cannot wait to kiss this year goodbye. It has been annoying, and I'm sure most of you can agree. It's also been lackluster as well. But anyway, I'm just rambling just to make this podcast longer. I'm sure you guys want to do other things. I have spare ribs and egg noodles waiting for me, so I think I'm going to end this podcast, like I always do, by saying I was the Angry Raccoon, and I will see you on the next podcast.